Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. For this episode of BioScience Talks, I was joined by Dr. Dietram Scheufele, who's a professor in science communication at the University of Wisconsin. He joined us to talk about synthetic biology, and in particular about synthetic biologists' attitudes about scientific ethics and regulation. But we also chatted a lot about scientific communication more generally, which is a topic that I'm sure is near and dear to many of you, as it is to us. Anyway, we covered a lot of ground, so let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Scheufele, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, before we get into the specifics of your article, I was hoping you could maybe give us a very broad overview of what we mean when we say the term synthetic biology. What does that encompass? What kinds of things are we talking about?
Sure. I think when we're talking about synthetic biology, we're talking about something that's very broad and has really led to a lot of invention since then. But it's really traditionally, when we've done biology, we've looked at the world of organic life in as much detail as we possibly could and try to figure it out. And we did selective breeding, we did all these things. Synthetic biology really says that we're almost doing it from in the other direction, meaning from the bottom up, that we're trying to use the building blocks, we're trying to detect and identify the building blocks of nature, of organic life, and are trying to build sometimes new organisms from that. And I think the most vivid case of that, of course, was when J. Craig Venter in 2010 claimed to have invented or created life in the lab when he inserted synthetic DNA into a live bacterial cell, and as many people described it, jump-started life in the lab. So that's, I think, how it broadly described the field.
And just thinking about that rather in terms of, new fields or emerging fields, would we expect to see this sort of technology in medicine, for instance, editing a genome to remove the likelihood of a future tumor occurrence or something like that?
I think this is where we're really talking about new fields that have emerged since then, and CRISPR, this new editing technique that allows us to edit the genome in much more efficient, much safer, and ultimately cheaper ways. That was invented both at Berkeley and at the Broad Institute at MIT and at Harvard. That's probably one of the extensions that would apply there more, meaning that we can actually edit the genome, that we can almost search and replace parts of the genome. And so if there's a term, if you think about a Word file, almost a Word document that has a typo, and every time you write the word "and," you put AMD instead of AND, and CRISPR would go through and find that and take that out. So that was really one of the extensions that came out of the idea of synthetic biology.
And that's obviously going to produce quite a few sort of ethical considerations. What's the broad scope of the, kind of ethical landscape for synthetic biology? Recognizing, of course, that each project and each subfield is going to have its own set of particular issues to deal with.
Sure. I think it's really important to realize that the motivation for both for synthetic biology, I think, and for applications since then, if that's CRISPR or anything else, or spin-offs, are really therapeutic. So they're motivations that say, well, we want to tackle diseases that we've just never been able to tackle. Very often inherited diseases, if that's Huntington's, if that's Tay-Sachs, things that are really potentially debilitating influences on the people who have those diseases. But of course, all of these things come with implications. So, for instance, these are going to be really expensive technologies. And we right now in the US certainly are in a scenario where a lot of people don't have money for preventive dental care. So why would those, or how would those groups have access to a really expensive technology? So is it going to be a technology that's reserved only for the rich? That's one question. The question of equity and access, but also a question of what that, for example, does to our understanding of, for example, disabilities. We have a lot of communities, and the deaf communities and others, who would argue that there's nothing, that this is not a condition that needs fixing, that needs a treatment, but that's actually a large part of their identity. So this idea that some communities may choose to use synthetic biology or CRISPR or new applications to have their diseases addressed or cured, where others don't, will that then lead, for example, to new types of discrimination? Because people are going to ask, well, did you not have the money? Why did you choose to not get this health condition or whatever one might call it? addressed. And so I think there are lots of questions about access, about what it means to have a disability. There are also questions if we are really editing, and this goes back to your initial questions, what is synthetic biology? If we're really building biology from the bottom up, are we actually playing God? Are we creating organic life in a way? And when J. Craig Venter, as I mentioned, said, I created life in a lab. If you're a deeply religious person, that's going to raise some questions for you in terms of us overstepping potentially moral boundaries. And if you're not a religious person, and I happen to be probably on that end of the spectrum, even then it will raise questions if that's something that human beings should do, that we're overstepping potentially moral boundaries if they're religious or not. So I think it's something that where the ethics and the morality of it, I think for all of us, raise some questions.
And so, and we've probably seen, perhaps even a preview of some of those questions. I was interested that you brought up the deaf community. The cochlear implants issue is actually almost a preview. Obviously, it's a completely different technology, but it raises some of those same questions, and we've seen some of the, the initial argument that can occur as a result.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think we're seeing in a lot of the technologies over time raising more and more of those issues. And we actually asked in some previous work, we looked at some of the legacy technologies like nuclear energy, right, where we kind of thought about the risks and the benefits. And then also we asked about nanotechnology. So this is one of where we could make modifications at the molecular level with new types of microscopes, scanning tunnel microscopes, much more precision in what we could see, actually a precursor to synthetic biology. So that was a technology where we could, for the first time, create materials that don't exist in nature. And then synthetic biology. So we asked about all three, to which degree those were pushing boundaries. And the more, and really the surveys that we did among the general population really showed that people saw more and more of that boundary pushing going on, the more these technologies allowed us to do things that were maybe unnatural, or that address things that had been just a given for a long time. So I think your point is really well taken, that a lot of these things, the needle registered a little bit for previous technologies, but it's really registering more and more and more now.
Okay, and so that's among the general population. In this study in particular, though, you were looking at researchers, both those who have written about the ethics and legal aspects, and those who do synthetic biology themselves.
Yep.
What's the motivation for looking at those groups rather than say the general public?
Yeah, so and that's a really good question, and it's in many ways I would say there are two things that are important. First of all, I think most of us in the academic community and the scholarly community, of course, realize that we are the public, or part of the public, for most issues. We're experts for a very narrow slice, and we're consumers of science in most disciplines that are not our own. Let's say if most of us go to a doctor to help us if we are sick, or if we need surgery. That's not an area of expertise, even if we're scientists. So we rely on the expertise of others, very much like other members of the public do. But number two is, we've been doing this work for a while, looking at experts, not just people who work in a particular field, but really going in and looking at the people who are the most highly published, most highly cited people in a particular field. And why is that important? Because, of course, some of these technologies, I think, and we saw this for nanotechnology, we saw this for others, we see a growing awareness among the scientific community that their inventions don't just raise technical questions about the scientific risks or benefits, but of course have larger societal implications. And historically, that's again not new at all. We saw nuclear physicists and chemists write letters to the American president before and during World War II, urging the creation of the Manhattan Project, and then write letters again afterwards, urging to not drop the nuclear bomb. So we've had for a long time scientists really getting involved in the larger ethical, social questions. And I think for synthetic biology, of course, it really was a topic where we wanted to know, to which degree is there this broader awareness, this debate, and what do scientists think about these applications? And I think one of the really prominent examples that many of us have seen in news media is Jennifer Doudna, for instance, at Berkeley, who has spoken very, very publicly about applications of CRISPR and what that might do to our idea of being human, and what kind of broader societal debates that requires. I think there's some really visible public spokespeople now in the academic community as well.
Yeah, and that brings up something that I often wonder about, which is the different role of scientists in outreach in the present era versus say 40 or 50 years ago. 40 or 50 years ago, everything was sort of passed through a filter of large media outlets if it was going to reach the general public. But today, obviously, things are quite different, and scientists are speaking to large groups directly. Does that have implications for synthetic biology in particular? Is this a different task than it was previously?
I think it is. I think what you're describing is absolutely right, and it's one development, meaning that we used to have this idea of broadcast media, three people sitting there at news desks of NBC, ABC, reading the news to the American public, and that has changed dramatically. I think, especially in the area of science, we now have less than half of all the states in the United States actually still have a newspaper with a science section. So that means a lot of newspapers in a lot of states don't have a single newspaper that has a section devoted exclusively to science. We have, we saw a deterioration over time of attention to science and so on and so forth. What that means is that scientists themselves, and former president of the academies, Ralph Cicerone, spoke very powerfully to this. Scientists themselves need to fill the gap a little bit. And of course, there are new opportunities to do that, to speak to the public directly. But I would add a second element, and Alan Leshner, who was CEO of AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is one of the largest generalist scientist organizations, in the early 2000s said something that I thought was very powerful. And he said, we need to have an honest bidirectional dialogue with the public about some of these technologies. And not just about the perils, he said, not just about the promise, he said, but also about the perils and the pitfalls. So scientists have to be more and more honest about what these very disruptive technologies are going to bring, both positively, but also, thinking through some of the potential downsides down the road. And you hearing that in the early 2000s or mid 2000s from within the scientific community, I think was extremely powerful, and really highlighted this need to have these broader conversations. And I think historically now, in the 70s, when recombinant DNA came along, we had Asilomar and scientists and a few policymakers getting together and trying to resolve this behind closed doors, the directions of science that science should go into. And then just 2 years ago, we saw the first global summit in Washington between the Chinese Academy, the U.S. Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society, the German Academy, French Academy, a very public meeting to discuss the future of human genome editing. And I think that really, our transition from where Asilomar was as a closed-door meeting in California to a very public get-together internationally of scientists, the public, patients, journalists. I think that really shows how far we've come and how the way we communicate with the public in a bidirectional way has really become the norm rather than the exception.
And so is the motivation for a survey like the one that we're discussing today to develop a baseline. We're at the point of the emergence of this large conversation as the technology itself emerges. Mm-hmm. Is the idea to develop a baseline and sort of understand the parameters of that conversation?
It's partly that, to understand the baseline and where the scientific community is, and we have data that parallel this that also show where the public is. So very often that allows us to see where some of the disconnects are, right? So is, for example, the public not seeing some of the risks that experts might be seeing? But it's also something that I think allows us to gauge a little bit where we are within the scientific community on questions of morality, which or of questions of us messing with nature. And for example, in our data, we found that a vast majority of scientists, regardless if they were in the social sciences or if they're in the bench sciences and natural physical sciences, thought that synthetic biology, of course, is morally acceptable. It is something that doesn't violate necessarily their views of morality. But at the same time, they did acknowledge, and 20, 30, 40%, depending on which particular disciplinary subgroup we looked at, also thought that, yes, it does mess with nature. It does really make modifications to nature that previously we didn't make. So it shows also some of the complexity that the issue brings with it, regardless of what one's moral views might be. There's still an acknowledgement of what it does scientifically.
So that sounds like it's painting a very complex picture. Just stepping back for a moment, could you tell us a little bit about, sort of the survey design, who you were
Sure.
speaking to, how many people, and what they thought?
Yeah, and that's a really, I think, an important question for surveys of scientists. I think there's a lot of news items around that say, well, this is what scientists think, and very often they're based on really poorly done surveys. And it's actually complicated to figure out, if you think about it, right? If you wanted to survey all synthetic biologists, how do you do that? And one way of doing that is to first figure out who actually publishes in this field, who does research in this field. And we have various databases for academic publications, Web of Science being one of them. So where you can go in and you can look at all the articles that have been written. But of course, it's not just on the term synthetic biology. So we have actually a large search string that looks at different applications, instrumentation in that field. So it's multiple pages. And then we go in and search for all the articles. And then we reorganize the data set in a way that allows us now to look at who are the most cited and the most published people in this field. So we can rank the sample in different ways. And then we basically take a subsample of that. So let's say the top 1,000, just for the sake of an example here, the top 1,000, and then we sent them a questionnaire, typically in the mail. And of course, all of us who've gotten surveys and have not responded, we know how that then works. And in survey research, we typically do at least 2 more follow-ups, which means people get more surveys, they get reminder postcards, and then they get an email follow-up. So we do actually multiple rounds to maximize, because what you want to do is you don't just want to interview the people who respond quickly, who are most interested in the topic, but you really want to get a pretty good representation of everybody, even the people who are reluctant to maybe answer because they don't want to get into the topic. It's the same that we do for general public surveys, but for scientists, of course, it's a bit more complicated because there's no directory, if you will. There's no single list of all scientists. So developing that and then really carefully recontacting over time to get as high a response rate as we had, 30-40%, is really important. And that's actually pretty good for expert surveys.
Yeah, that seems very good. And it seems important, too, because, those who are most passionate in one way or another are probably most likely to immediately respond to a survey.
No, that's exactly it. And very often you end up with what's called a bimodal distribution. So this is, if you plotted the opinions, you get a little bubble at both ends, meaning the people really in favor or really opposed. And that's exactly what you want to avoid. You want to get the whole distribution of opinions in the academic community.
And so what kind of questions did you ask?
So we asked, of course, a whole bunch of demographic questions,
Sure.
right? So we want to know, for instance, and that's not, that's not trivial. So in the sense, we wanted to know, for example, how early in their career people were. And we know from previous research, for instance, that younger researchers are much more excited about seeking that dialogue with the public and engaging than maybe somebody who is in the last years of their career and has grown up in a very different paradigm, a very different time, and used to very different types of communication. So we ask about age, about academic age, meaning how long they've been in the field. We ask about discipline. We ask about gender. We ask about race and those things, of course, to get a sense of the overall demographic makeup. And then we ask basically questions about the technical risks. So these are questions where we want to know, and this is also based on previous research, we know that a lot of their attitudes toward a technology is driven by their expert assessment, which is exactly what you would want, right? You want a scientist to think through, what do I think the technical risks and benefits are, and then I make a judgment. And then, of course, we also ask things like ideology, because we know, and we've known for a long time, that as objective as we all are in the academic community, if I ask you about policy stances, my ideology or my partisanship still determines, for example, my views toward regulation, with liberal academics being more likely to support new regulations, than conservative academics who are less likely to support that, even after controlling out the technical assessment. And then the last group of questions really looked at general attitudes. So, and I mentioned a couple of them earlier. Did they agree, for example, that Synbio, synthetic biology, was morally acceptable, that it messes with nature, that it gives humans too much power, that it allows humans to play God? So kind of some of the key arguments that have been made. And I mentioned the J. Craig Venter example earlier. There were some really beautiful magazine covers when he inserted synthetic DNA into a live bacterial cell of him holding a test tube with Frankenstein in the test tube, kind of and kind of playing to that idea of are humans playing God? Are they overstepping moral boundaries?
And by and large, I would assume that the synthetic biologists don't think that it's morally unacceptable to do what they do.
Exactly, and we saw that both among the bench scientists, actually, and the social scientists, who thought that it was definitely morally acceptable to do work in that area, but there were some clearly decent percentages or significant percentages of both synthetic biologists and people who work more in the social and ethical aspects of it, who also thought that, as I said earlier, that it messes with nature.
So messing with nature, but by and large, acceptably so among the survey respondents.
Exactly, and very little pickup of the argument that it gives humans necessarily too much power. I think there were a few more people who are undecided among the ethical and the social science side of things, or that it allows humans to play God. So again, very little pickup of those arguments in the academic community.
Now, I'm kind of interested by that concept because it seems to be something that reappears every time you discuss any emerging technology. People are, worry, has science gone too far? Are we playing God?
Absolutely.
Is kind of the way it's usually phrased. Does that idea have more currency within the general public than it does among scientists?
So ironically, it doesn't necessarily. It definitely has more currency. So in a relative sense, to answer your question precisely, but it doesn't necessarily have overwhelming currency in the sense that it overrides other considerations. And I think this goes back to, when we were earlier at the very beginning talked about the therapeutic purposes that a lot of the early applications have pursued. I think that really puts it in a particular context. So the idea that we're curing disease with this, we're trying to do things that in a therapeutic sense that we haven't been able to do before. So that's not necessarily playing God. And I think even for some religious communities and religious leaders, they've expressed similar views. I think that can change very, very quickly once we look into applications that may appear more trivial. So once we use synthetic biology or even specific tools that have come since then, like CRISPR, to let's say eye color of babies, right? So all of a sudden, I think that we would see a very different set of applications. In our survey data, we did a survey specifically. This is now public opinion, so general public, on CRISPR applications, showed that really that's where people draw the line. So, for example, editing the human germline in heritable ways, so that the genome is edited in heritable ways for enhancement purposes, so to make people taller or change eye color. That's really where public opinion is starting to turn and says, no, that's something that we're really against.
Is there any insight into what synthetic biologists themselves think about that kind of issue, those more trivial changes?
Yeah, and we don't have we didn't ask a lot of questions about those completely trivial applications for scientists. I would assume that we're seeing that among, and this is really my educated guess, not based on data. I need to make that clear. But I would assume that we would see an even stronger opposition of scientists against that. I think there's a line though that is really important, and that's a distinction. And we've heard this. I was part of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's committee on the political and scientific implications of human genome editing, and some of the people that we spoke to, I think, really make a very clear distinction, and I think it's an important one, between basic research and then these applications, right? So some of the basic research will look at applications that may seem trivial or something that the general public may oppose, and I think, if you look, for instance, at some of the work that's being done at the Salk Institute in California on human pig hybrids and to grow organs, some people in the public and the general public would see that as trivial, but of course it's an unbelievably important application for basic research to understand how we can potentially at some point grow organs that are tailored toward a person's genome and will not be rejected by the body. So in other words, I think that distinction between basic and applied research is one that is my guess we would pick up in surveys of scientists if we asked about how trivial an application or a particular area of research might seem to the general public.
It sounds like a lot's at stake in terms of the way that the outreach is handled, because if it goes poorly, you wind up with a general public that's potentially wildly opposed to something that would be incredibly beneficial.
Sure. And I totally agree. And I think we've seen that for GM crops in many ways, for genetically modified organisms in food and agriculture. I think we've handled that as a scientific community and partly, of course, also the industry handled that pretty poorly, and we're still paying for that. Having said this, I don't think that the purpose of engagement or of these broader debates is just to prevent public outrage. In fact, I don't think that's the purpose. I think a lot of these technologies raise very legitimate, larger questions that we as a society need to answer, right? And I mentioned some earlier, the question of access and of who can afford to use these, the question of if it is morally acceptable to change the human genome in heritable ways, for instance. If we want to do that as a society, there's no clear scientific answer to that. The scientific answer, we only have clear scientific answer to technical questions, meaning is it going to be safe? Are there going to be, what are the risks and technical risks and benefits going to be? But if we should do it, if society should go down that path, that's really a broader political and ethical question. And I think we need to have a broader debate about this. So I would argue, yes, you're absolutely right. I think it's an important discussion. A lot of it is at stake. If it's handled poorly, it can very much raise totally unfounded concerns that just scientifically and in any other way don't make any sense. And we've seen this for GM crops. But at the same time, I think it goes way beyond that. It's not a matter of managing, quote unquote, public opinion. And instead, it's really, we do need those broader debates, and we do need them early on in the development, so we can really come as a society to a conclusion in which pathways we want to pursue and which ones we may see as too risky.
Okay, so this next question is a bit of a two-parter then. I'm curious, what went wrong with the GM crop debate? Mm-hmm. And how would you like to see the synthetic biology conversation unfold on a national and global scale? Mm-hmm. What can be learned and what can be done differently?
So, it is a two-part and it's a complicated one. I think a lot went wrong. Not at all. A lot went wrong with the GM crops debate. I think in part that from the very beginning, I think we paid very little to the attention to the communication aspect of the whole thing. We really saw this as a technical problem, and we applied what we in science communication often call the knowledge deficit model. And what that says is, if people just thought like scientists, if they knew all the facts, then they would come to the same conclusion that we as scientists do, meaning it's safe and we should all eat it, right? The problem with it is that 40, 50 years of social science has shown that that's just not true. Meaning, people will never think just like scientists. And even if they're highly informed, very often they interpret that information that they have in very different ways. So some of the most informed people on GM crops, for instance, are people who are at extremely opposite ends of attitudes, meaning they're either completely in favor or completely against. So it's just not human nature to think like scientists and to use information in the same way. So what we did is we talked about about all the facts, and that it's what we thought was the idea that it's 1,600 peer-reviewed studies, and they all show that it's just as safe for human consumption as traditionally bred crops. And of course, that's all true. The problem, of course, is that there was a single campaign by Greenpeace that offered a very simple counter argument to this, and that counter argument had nothing to do with information. It had something to do with one word, and that was Frankenfood. And I mentioned earlier the title of J. Craig Venter with a test tube and Frankenstein in there. Why is that so powerful in terms of communication? Because it ties, simply by saying Franken, I tie the issue to a mental shelf or a mental interpretive schema that we all have, right? When we process new information, we put it metaphorically on little shelves in our head. It's kind of, where does it fit and what does it connect to? And Franken says connected to scientists putting stuff together that doesn't belong together, screwing Frankenstein together. So transgenics and so on and so forth. That stuff gets out of control and gets out of the lab. And number two, Frankenstein and the Frankenstein's monster. And then it's difficult to rein it back in. It has unintended consequences. And all of that happens because of scientific hubris, meaning Frankenstein as a scientist. So the whole point being, a single word tells me all the reasons why I shouldn't support GMOs. And we've done a very poor job of doing the opposite, meaning saying, what are the value propositions? Why is this important? Why is it important for us to really invest in new food technologies and more efficient crops? And And I think we communicated very well why it's good for industry. I think we've communicated much more poorly why it's good for consumers. And I think that was a large part of the GM debate. I think the same thing is true for synthetic biology. The same thing will be true for various gene editing technologies. Unless we can show a value proposition for consumers that says this is, and this is true for every technology, right? I mean, if I get appendicitis surgery, there is a risk, but I see the value proposition. If I get on a plane, there's a risk, but I'm not going to be in LA tomorrow unless I take a plane. So I see the value proposition. Even if I get stitches, of course I'm getting stitches. Of course there's a risk, but I don't want that gushing head wound. And I think the same thing is true for Synbio and for any of the applications that come out of it. Unless we can really have a broader discussion about the different benefits and risks and why the benefits for us as a community and a society at this point in history outweigh the benefits, we're going to have a real problem. And I think and we need to communicate that in ways that resonates with where the audience is, not where the scientists are. I think that's kind of where we produced disconnects in the past, that we've really communicated about the science. This is why it's exciting to us as scientists, but that's not why it's going to be adopted by consumers or in society. It's going to be adopted because it's important to them. The iPhone is not successful because it's scientifically complex and interesting. It's successful because it satisfies a very particular consumer demand.
So the idea here would be to present Synbio advancements and technologies in terms of their value proposition to the general public, and to resist the framing of, Franken whatever, or any sort of widely used trope about scientists who have overstepped their bounds or something like that.
I think that's part of it, and I think also part of it is to actually figure out where the concerns and the excitement is among the general public, and really develop toward products or applications in that area first. I think that's the exciting part about human genome editing with CRISPR, for instance, that there's a very clear therapeutic value proposition for really debilitating diseases like Huntington's or Tay-Sachs or others, where it's very clear why we would want to address those and what the contributions are. I think that's a much easier sell than it ever was for GM crops, for instance.
So, is there anything at this point, or in the coming years, that synthetic biologists should be doing in terms of their outreach? Should they be sharing information with the general public on Twitter? Should they be reaching out and speaking with reporters every time they have a new finding and publish something? Should they also be trying to solicit news articles about the same? Obviously, it's challenging to corral a whole large number of scientists and get them to agree on things and do things. But what in an ideal world would they be doing, to further this discussion and to share information, or not share information, but have this conversation with the general public?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things. I mean, and one I would just almost flippantly say is listen. I think one of the things that we as scientists very often assume is that we know what's best for everybody else. And I described this earlier as the knowledge deficit model, right? We're filling those knowledge deficits, and then people will think like us. But part of it, especially for Synbio and related technologies, is the idea that listening is really core. What are the concerns among the general public? What are some of the concerns among particular communities? We talked about the deaf community and others. What is the kind of societal environment within which we're developing these new technologies and that are potentially being disrupted by these? And that will influence how we're then going to communicate. That's what Alan Leshner meant by this honest bidirectional dialogue. Bidirectional dialogue really does require for us to listen and to have these broader conversations. So I think that's number one. But then number two is, I think you're absolutely right, that a lot of it then is about, using different channels and collaborating. And that's partly why we looked at the sample that we looked at, collaborating across different academic disciplines. Synthetic biology is actually similar in many ways, ironically, to an issue like climate change, which is not just a technical scientific issue. It's also a political issue. It's an issue that affects sociology, psychology, political science, communication research. So in other words, I think these are a lot of issues. These are all issues that will involve, or will have to involve, collaborations that are interdisciplinary. What we at Wisconsin do, for instance, in the Department of Life Sciences Communication, we offer a transcriptable minor for bench scientists in science communication. So if you get a PhD in genetics, or if you get a PhD in microbio, you can also get a PhD minor that will be on your transcript later in science communication by taking a sequence of courses and building some of that expertise that says, well, this is how people think about these technologies. These are some of the ways of communicating. These are some of the political dynamics that may surround this. So I think we're beginning also to build infrastructures within the academic community to train students in ways that certainly all of us who are older were not trained to think, and I think that's an exciting development.
And we'll certainly look forward to seeing more. Dr. Scheufele, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.